Ooh. Okay. Did you
Got
say
it.
it? All right. So hello, dear friend Jack Frech. Thank you for taking the time today to talk to us about the history of community action, COAD, the war on poverty, and other relevant items that you've spent your life working on. We just have a couple of questions to talk about together, and I thank you for helping me and our staff to better situate ourselves in the work that we're doing today and what's come before this. So first, will you just please tell us a little bit about your personal history and your connection to COAD since it's early days?
Thank you, Megan, for inviting me to do this. It's an honor and a privilege to address folks from COAD, an organization that I have a great deal of respect for and history with. My name is Jack Frech. I was, for the most of my career, for the last 33 years, I was the Director of Job and Family Services in Athens, Ohio. I also spent some time as a welfare caseworker, social worker, and probably most relevant to this, I spent 5 years as the Deputy Director at Hocking Athens Perry Community Action, which, by the way, came about because my roommate in college was Doug Stanley. Doug, who some of you may have known as the previous director at HAPCAP. After graduation, and Doug and I and folks were all hanging around town, and his brother happened to have a job as the deputy director of HAPCAP. And he was leaving town and convinced me, even though I'd basically only been a social worker up to this time and caseworker, to apply for the job. And oddly enough, this speaks volumes to the level the CAP agencies were at the time. They hired me to be the deputy director, and this was 1976. I was all of 25 years old, and that was my essential, getting tossed into the fire here with the community action world. I was very much taken with the sense of mission about helping poor people, and of course, I'd had some experience with that from the welfare department, and it was also my initiation to the world of COAD. COAD was at that time very new, had only been around a few years. The CAP agencies were very much concerned about maintaining local control. So as a result, the programs in COAD were administered by individual CAP agencies. So the senior nutrition program was down in Ironton. HAPCAP had the weatherization program, the planning office. I think Jackson Vinton maybe had foster grandparents. I mean, they were kind of spread around like that because quite honestly, the CAP directors were not, they were concerned about the centralization of all this and wanted to maintain their local control. So that was, kind of what was going on with me personally and the world of community action and COAD.
Thanks. Interesting themes that have repeated throughout our history.
Absolutely.
Let's take it back out to a little bit of a bigger picture and hear about your perspective on the Great Society and all of the things that actually made this work possible from the Johnson administration and a little before, but we'll try to focus at Johnson because I know it's there's so much.
Absolutely. Well, I think that there was a heightened awareness of poverty and those issues during the Kennedy administration. Kennedy famously had visited, Appalachia and brought attention to the struggles that people had here, and it made certainly that, and plus his campaigning in the inner cities, really opened his eyes up to the struggles that people were having. And they had done some pilot programs. They had indicated they were concerned about those issues, and of course, early on, they'd got involved in civil rights and other issues that were, kind of the progressive issues of the time, of which, obviously JFK was one of the champions. And then, of course, when he was, assassinated, and the country was very much in mourning, and Lyndon Johnson took over. Johnson, who had actually been a much more powerful politician over the years, had and much more experience with actual legislation, he picked up that mantle and, committed himself to carrying out that progressive agenda in, in what he called the Great Society and the War on Poverty. Those were essentially, his way of carrying out that legacy, and one that he was very much committed to personally himself, very much so. He was a big fan of Roosevelt and the New Deal. I mean, that's kind of where he came up through that whole process. So I think he saw himself in that role, and so as a result, he launched this whole series of programs, around that. And I think, and again, we'll talk a little more specifically about the War on Poverty, but in terms of the Great Society, and let me, if I could just read you a quote from Johnson. When Johnson was campaigning to get this legislation passed, he actually came to Athens, Ohio, in May 7th of 1964 and gave a speech here. And this was part of his campaign to get this legislation passed. So, one of the quotes from his speech goes kind of like this. It says, "So let your young hearts armed with new weapons join in an old battle against ancient enemies, the enemies of poverty, disease, illiteracy, strife, and bigotry. And with your courage and your compassion and your desire, we will build the Great Society. It is a society where no child will go unfed, no youngster will go unschooled, where no man who wants work will fail to find it, where no citizen will be barred from any door because of his birthplace or his color or his church, where peace and security is common among neighbors and possible among nations." I mean, those are the kind of speeches that people gave back in those days. And not only did he give this speech, but he put immense effort behind this. So some of the things that came out of his legislative agenda, which he immediately was, as I say, campaigning for in early '64. This went through pretty much 1965. Medicare was created through this. Medicaid was created through this. Civil rights legislation, voting rights legislation, which of course we're familiar with the fights going on about that, continually. Appalachian Regional Commission, the Older Americans Act, food stamps, legal aid, VISTA, Head Start, Job Corps, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was the first act to provide federal funding for low-income schools, urban renewal, consumer product safety, National Endowment for the Humanities and Arts. The list goes on and on. There were like 40 programs
Amazing.
that were created from this, many of which, we just take for granted today. However, obviously when I was young, these programs didn't exist. And all came about, as a result of Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society and War on Poverty. And then finally, the one that I think we're most focused on today here is the Office of Economic Opportunity and Community Action Agencies. See, it was part of this whole plan about the War on Poverty was trying to give more people more power, giving them a seat at the table. So one of the things the initial legislation required is that there be the maximum feasible participation of poor people in the planning and implementation of these programs. And the way they were going to do that was through community action agencies. So they actually gave funding to communities to put together groups of people primarily controlled by poor people to identify what their own issues are, to take action on them, to apply for and get federal funding to do those programs. That's what it was all about initially. Ironically, in some ways, they were too successful because what ended up happening is a lot of these communities, along with the VISTA program and legal aid and other kind of advocacy groups, were actually becoming very effective at advocating for issues related to education, healthcare, public assistance benefits. So much so that they were actually threatening the local elected officials and state officials They were quite concerned and upset by this because it actually was working. And, poor people were making demands. In some ways, we're victims of our own success in that, because then a couple years later, 1967, they passed something they call the Green Amendments that basically took away the control of poor people over these organizations and created the boards as they are now today, where a third of the board must be local elected officials, a third are community members, business, nonprofits, and only a third of the representation are from poor people. So essentially assuring that poor people would not control these organizations. And that was kind of the start of the assault on the war on poverty and community action agencies. Shortly thereafter, with the election of Richard Nixon, Nixon was not a big fan of these programs. He put Donald Rumsfeld, who some of you may be very familiar with during the Vietnam and other wars later, put him in charge of community action and basically gave him the assignment to dismantle it. So they started, first of all, just taking the program, Head Start, and moving it to education, and from the weatherization program. Well, they didn't even have a Department of Energy then, but they started, this was a process that went on where they started taking programs, dismantling them, and then trying to basically defund the community action agencies. This was, again, kind of further advanced later on, a few years later, with Ronald Reagan, who also wanted to eliminate them, who kept, proposing zero funding, further dismantling. And what would happen at each of these times is, while they were trying to get rid of them, because these programs were so popular, because people, were really benefiting from them, congressmen, each time would step in and Congress would save the program. Although over time it became greatly reduced. With Reagan, it actually became a block grant. I mean, all these things were kind of chipping away at it, but they could never really get rid of it. Because the truth of the matter is that, the community action agencies were very functional, were providing very necessary services, in these communities. And those, the services varied widely depending on the needs of the community. In some cases, community action agencies get very involved in healthcare and are now operating clinics. Other cases, they were much more involved in housing, home repair, education programs. Of course, most of them ran weatherization, most of them ran Head Start, things like there were some common programs. But, there was one point I know one of the CAP agencies up north was running a railroad line. They ran swimming pools. I mean, juvenile delinquency programs. You can go on and on and on with the wide variety of things, because community, it was just that. It was community action, based on what the needs were in that community, and with leadership, from this wide range now, this broader board, they stepped up to meet community needs, and they're still doing that today. I think, it's absolutely true that during, a lot of that, because of this political pressure, community action became less involved in advocacy and more involved in program operation as a way of advocating. And that's, certainly true today. But that same thing happened to Legal Aid and Vista. A lot of them, had a lot of restrictions imposed to kind of limit their capacity to do political advocacy. But I think, that's what kind of led us to where we're at with community action agencies today. I think they're very vital. In almost any county, the major poverty agencies are going to be the welfare department, job and family services, and the community action agency. They're the folks who take care of the poor people. And I think, that's a kind of a proud and long heritage, and they have had to fight tooth and nail this whole time to retain that foothold, but fortunately they're still there plugging away.
And indeed a proud legacy. And I think our COAD staff will talk a little bit more about how COAD isn't exactly a community action agency, but is a network of community action agencies, and how that is our heritage. And I think you've already spoken to some of what I was hoping to get at, which is how community action has been so resilient despite all of that resistance. I think you spoke really well to the fact that they are really based in the community, and they do what is needed for the community that they serve as a result of the conversations they have with the local representation that makes up their governance. And so I think I will include some additional resources for people to read up on the history and the progress of community action. I think I'd like to turn us a little to focus on Appalachia, and particularly as we think about how COAD sits within the Community Action Network. Just looking at what Appalachian Regional Development has looked like kind of as the bigger picture, the starting of the Appalachian Regional Commission, which is one of our funders, recent funders and ongoing funders, and also the Governor's Office of Appalachia. And I think there's some interesting COAD history that you were a part of that speaks to how COAD is both in support of community action and also advancing the Appalachian region. So can you tell us a little story about that?
Sure. I mean, I think there's no doubt that even within the community action word, COAD, is the agency that focuses on the region, on the whole region, and has had that role for many, many years. And I think that again, remembering that Johnson and Kennedy, their eyes were really open to the poverty they saw in Appalachia. That was very, very influential with them. So they did create, Johnson did create the Appalachian Regional Commission. And to call attention to the area and to focus more resources on the area. I think early on, I know my experience was that there were lots of grants and things that particularly early on that ARC funded around human services, funding daycare programs, transportation programs, healthcare programs. A lot of the programs that are up there and up and running now were started in our region with ARC funding. And they were very much involved in that. As time went on, I think they got to be more involved in, bricks and mortar and those kind of things and economic development. But early on, in particular, when they actually had more money, they were very much involved directly in human services, and of course, very close ally working with community action agencies. I think it's interesting that in 1985, when all of these programs were about 20 years old, there was Roger McCauley, who at that time was the COAD planning director of planning and development. He wouldn't become the executive director for a number of years after that, because as I mentioned before, the cap agencies were very fearful of creating this, entity. But he was very much seen in the state as a leading spokesperson for the region and poor people. Him and I and Bob Garbo and several other folks, as this 20th anniversary was approaching, felt that there should be something done about it. And quite honestly, under the leadership of Roger and COAD, they reorganized a conference called Appalachia 20 Years Later, in which we called together leaders throughout the region in not just community action, but in healthcare, in environment, in education, in economic development, job training, all those kind of things. And we pulled together these committees, basically, who came together and planned this big event, where we would, look at the history of what we had done over the last 20 years to show the accomplishments. And there were many. We had some major folks there. The Sergeant Shriver, who was the first director of the War on Poverty. Jennings Randolph, who was the author of the OEO bill. We had the director of ARC there. Not only that, but we had major elected officials. The governor sent a video, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, all these people showed up. All these elected officials showed up to this conference at Ohio University. And it was several days. And, it was an opportunity for us to get together and really strategize around each of these issues. So we came up with an agenda for each of those areas that we wanted to promote. And to help do this, we created an Appalachian task force, which basically took those same people who helped plan this and put them together in kind of an ongoing standing committee to work on these issues and help push legislation to get those things through. There was also created out of that meeting an Appalachian delegation of representatives, state reps, and senators from the region who started meeting after that as a result of this meeting and working collectively across party lines over issues that were of interest to the region. So it was through the combination of this task force and that delegation that we advocated for one of our main priorities, which was the creation of a governor's office of Appalachia, which we were quite obviously successful in doing because that office exists this very day. It was very heady times in some ways because, we definitely had the ear of the legislature. We had people working very hard in the region. This is kind of an example of, even though at the federal level, these were during the Reagan years and we did not see a whole lot of federal support, but we had a tremendous amount of support at that time from the state level. And that seems to work that way sometimes, I think in times when we get more federal support, sometimes our state support wanes, it just depends on the politics of it. But it was very exciting times, and there's absolutely no doubt that it was COAD and Roger McCauley who helped head that up and organize that. And so COAD had a very, very influential role in a lot of the things that came after that here in Ohio for the region.
Thank you for that tall order. I think it's important for us as our staff to really think about what COAD has been able to accomplish in the past, and everyone that will see this video that's a COAD employee will think about how their current work is an extension of that original stuff. And I hope everyone will also be inspired to think about what more we could do together. I know I spent a lot of time working on that and with the board thinking about where we can go next. So I think it's, a lot of work and effort went into that event. And here I'm going to display the binder that came out of it, which is like full of reports and research and information, of which a little bit I will be sharing in the context of the materials that'll go out for the orientation. But there's a ton of amazing work there. And I think it behooves us to look at what came before and think about where we might focus on in the future, because you're right, there's been a ton of success, but we still have a lot of work left to do.
Absolutely.
So I think that for now is enough of a tour of the past to get everyone hopefully situated and thinking about where we're headed now, and what we have, the shoulders we have to stand on are big, and it's amazing. So thanks for being a part of that history and for being willing to take the time to tell the stories for our staff today.
Well, thank you, and for your commitment to poverty and these programs, Megan, which I know is longstanding, and to your staff. I think the fact that this will be COAD employees watching this, your commitment, all of you, and your commitment to the well-being of your fellow citizens is to be admired and respected. So thank you all for your service.
Thanks, Jack.